September 7th, 1944. Fremantle, Western Australia, HMS Zwaardvis, a British T-class submarine transferred to the Royal Netherlands Navy, eased away from the depot ship HMS Maidstone and headed north into the Indian Ocean. Her destination, the Java Sea, waters too shallow and too dangerous for American submarines. Her mission, sink Japanese shipping in coastal waters where enemy convoys thought themselves safe. 72 hours later, Zwaardvis's commander spotted a small tanker hugging the Sumatra coast. One torpedo. The vessel exploded and sank within minutes. 5 days after that, October 6th, Goossens achieved something remarkable. He sank U-168, a German submarine carrying advanced technology to Japan. The same patrol netted the Japanese mine layer Itsukushima, the largest of its type in the Imperial Navy. By the time Zwaardvis returned to Fremantle after her first patrol from Australia, she'd destroyed 3 enemy vessels totaling over 2,000 tons. And she was just one submarine in what would become a British-led offensive that few remember today. Between September 1944 and August 1945, British and Dutch submarines operating from Australian bases hunted Japanese shipping in waters American boats avoided. They sank major warships, destroyed hundreds of coastal vessels, severed supply lines to Burma, and helped strangle Japan's collapsing war economy. The heavy cruiser Ashigara, last major Japanese warship sunk by submarines in the war, went down to a British torpedo. So did 3 enemy submarines, 6 naval vessels, and merchant shipping carrying vital supplies to isolated Japanese garrisons. This is the story of how Britain's submarine force arrived in Australia, operated in the shadow of America's Pacific campaign, and proved that sometimes the best strategy isn't building bigger weapons, but deploying the right weapons to places nobody else can reach. The mathematics were brutal and simple. By mid-1944, Allied submarines had devastated Japan's merchant marine. American boats prowling the Pacific had sunk over 4 million tons of shipping. Every month, more Japanese cargo vessels, tankers, and transports vanished beneath the waves. But mathematics also revealed a problem. American fleet submarines, the Gato and Balao classes, were magnificent ocean-going predators. They displaced 1,500 tons, carried 24 torpedoes, operated for 75 days without resupply, and cruised at 8,500-mile range. They dominated the deep Pacific, intercepting Japanese convoys between the home islands and resource-rich territories across Southeast Asia. But they had limitations. American boats drew 15 to 17 feet of water. Their size made them unwieldy in shallow seas. The Java Sea, Malacca Strait, and coastal waters around Sumatra and Borneo averaged 100 to 200 feet depth with numerous shoals, reefs, and narrow passages. American submarine doctrine emphasized deep water operations, torpedo attacks from extended range, crash dives to 400 feet when threatened. Japanese commanders understood this perfectly. By 1944, they routed coastal traffic through shallow waters where big American submarines couldn't effectively operate. Small merchant vessels, tankers under 2,000 tons, supply ships feeding garrisons in Burma, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies all hugged coastlines, taking advantage of American boats' inability to pursue them into reef-strewn shallows. The British Eastern Fleet, based at Trincomalee, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, faced exactly this problem. Their submarines operated in the Bay of Bengal and Malacca Strait since 1943, hunting Japanese shipping. By October 1944, they'd sunk a cruiser, 3 submarines, 6 small naval vessels, 40,000 tons of merchant ships, and nearly 100 small vessels. Respectable numbers, but the targets were getting smaller and scarcer. British submarines faced their own constraints. The 4th Submarine Flotilla at Ceylon was undersized and overextended. The Strait of Malacca offered limited targets. Most large Japanese vessels had retreated to Pacific waters, leaving only coastal traffic. Submarines spent weeks on patrol, finding nothing worth a torpedo. Then, in June 1944, the solution emerged from strategic necessity. Admiral Ernest King, commanding the US Navy, received a proposal from British Naval Command. Transfer some Ceylon-based submarines to Australia to expand operations into the Java and China seas. The British argued their boats could hunt targets in shallow waters American submarines couldn't reach. King approved, with conditions. The submarines would operate from Fremantle, Australia, the largest Allied submarine base in the Southern Hemisphere. They'd come under operational control of the US 7th Fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral James Fyfe. The British had to supply their own depot ship, their own supply chain, their own maintenance, and they had to prove their boats could handle the mission. August 1944, the 8th Submarine Flotilla, 6 British S-class and 3 T-class boats, plus Dutch submarines, Zwaardvis 019, 021 and 024, began arriving at Fremantle. The timing was deliberate. Italy's surrender in September 1943 had freed Royal Navy submarines from Mediterranean operations. Those boats, their crews battle-hardened from 3 years hunting Axis shipping, could be redeployed to the Pacific, where the war was entering its final decisive phase. The British faced skepticism immediately. American submarine crews at Fremantle had established routines, tactics, and an enviable record. Since 1942, boats based there had sunk more Japanese tankers than all other US submarines combined. American crews looked at the arriving British boats, smaller, older, less capable on paper, and questioned whether they'd contribute anything meaningful. The numbers told part of the story. British S-class submarines displaced 670 tons surfaced versus 1,525 for American Gatos. British boats carried 6 torpedo tubes and 12 torpedoes versus 10 tubes and 24 torpedoes for American boats. Range, 7,000 miles for S-class versus 11,000 miles for Gatos. Speed, 10 knots submerged versus 8.75 knots. Every metric suggested British submarines were inferior, except one, draft. British S-class boats drew just 10.5 feet of water versus 15 to 17 feet for American boats. That difference meant British submarines could operate in waters 40 to 50 feet shallower than American boats. In the Java Sea, where reefs lurked 60 to 80 feet below surface, that advantage was decisive. The British also brought different tactical approaches. American submarine doctrine emphasized independent operations, deep water attacks, single boats hunting alone. British doctrine, refined through Mediterranean operations, emphasized coordinated patrols, shallow water gun actions, close quarters combat. Where American boats avoided surface engagements, British boats carried deck guns specifically for attacking small coastal vessels not worth precious torpedoes. Cost considerations mattered too. Each American Mark 14 torpedo cost approximately $10,000 in 1944 dollars. Using 4 torpedoes to sink a 500-ton coastal freighter made no economic sense. British submarines could surface, engage with their 3-inch deck guns, and sink the same target for perhaps $50 worth of ammunition. In shallow coastal waters, where torpedo shots were difficult and targets were small, this capability transformed economics. The American Submarine Command at Fremantle, initially skeptical, quickly recognized the value proposition. Rear Admiral Fyfe allocated patrol areas accordingly. American boats would continue deep water operations intercepting major Japanese convoys. British boats would hunt inshore, attacking coastal traffic, interdicting supply runs to isolated garrisons, severing the small vessel networks that kept Japanese forces functioning. September 1944. The first British patrols launched from Fremantle. HMS Tantalus, an S-class boat, prowled the South China Sea for 55 days, longest British submarine patrol of the war. She rescued downed Allied airmen, gathered intelligence, attacked small craft with gunfire. HMS Sturdy operated in the Java Sea, developing tactics for sinking coastal vessels in ultra-shallow water. HMS Trenchant, a T-class boat with greater range and heavier armament, hunted in deeper waters approaching the Malacca Strait. The results accumulated quickly. October 1944. Sverdvish's triumph sinking U-168 and Itsukushima. November, multiple small merchant vessels destroyed. December, coastal supply routes disrupted. By year's end, British submarines operating from Fremantle had destroyed 30 small craft plus several larger vessels. Not spectacular individual numbers, but cumulatively devastating. The Japanese supply situation was collapsing. Every small tanker sunk meant fuel didn't reach forward airfields. Every coastal freighter destroyed meant food didn't reach isolated garrisons. Every supply barge blown apart by deck gunfire meant ammunition shortages on front lines. American submarines got headlines for sinking major warships and large merchant vessels. British submarines were strangling Japanese logistics at the capillary level. March 1945 brought the campaign's crescendo. By this time, British submarines had gained complete control of the Malacca Strait. No supplies reached Japanese forces in Burma by sea. The British boats operated wolf packs, coordinated groups of 2 or 3 submarines working together, tactics the Germans had used so effectively in the Atlantic. These groups positioned at choke points, hunted systematically, maintained constant pressure. The Royal Navy's submarine crews found themselves in a peculiar position. They were fighting a war that had already been won strategically. American submarines and B-29 bombers had crippled Japan's war economy, but still needed winning tactically. Every Japanese soldier fighting in Burma needed food, ammunition, medical supplies. Every airfield in Sumatra needed fuel. Every coastal garrison needed resupply. British submarines made that resupply progressively impossible. April 1945 brought reorganization. The 8th Flotilla moved from Fremantle to Subic Bay in the Philippines as American forces advanced. The 4th Flotilla transferred from Ceylon to Fremantle, expanding British submarine presence in Australian waters even as the war moved north. By this time, 38 British and Dutch submarines operated in the theatre, with 5 more en route from Europe. The final accounting tells a story rarely acknowledged. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, British submarines operating from Australian bases had sunk or destroyed approximately 40,000 tons of merchant shipping, 3 enemy submarines, 6 naval vessels, 1 heavy cruiser, and nearly 500 small craft. The numbers seem modest compared to American achievements. US submarines sank over 5 million tons total, until you examine the context. British submarines operated for barely 1 year from Australian bases versus 3 years for American boats. They focused on targets American submarines ignored: coastal shipping, small craft, shallow water operations. They provided specialized capability that complemented rather than competed with American efforts, and they accomplished this while operating in the most confined, dangerous waters of the Pacific Campaign. The economic calculation favors British contributions substantially. An American Gato-class submarine cost approximately $5 million to build in 1944 dollars. A British S-class submarine cost roughly £150,000, about 600,000 American dollars. Operating costs showed similar disparity. American boats consumed more fuel, required larger crews, demanded more extensive maintenance facilities. British boats were cheaper to build, cheaper to operate, and perfectly suited for missions that didn't require American boats' longer range and heavier armament. Consider the tonnage destroyed per dollar invested. If British submarines operating from Australia sank 40,000 tons of shipping using 9 boats, mix of British and Dutch, that's roughly 4,400 tons per boat. Cost per boat, approximately $600,000. That's 7.3 tons destroyed per dollar invested. American submarines achieved higher absolute numbers, but at substantially higher cost per ton destroyed. More significantly, British submarines operated where American boats couldn't or wouldn't go. The shallow draft advantage, the deck gun capability, the willingness to engage in close quarters surface actions, these weren't redundant capabilities. They were essential for choking off Japanese coastal logistics. Every 500-ton freighter sunk in the Java Sea was a mission an American submarine didn't need to undertake, preserving American boats for high-value targets in deep water. The story's most remarkable achievement occurred June 8, 1945. HMS Trenchant, commanded by Commander Arthur Heslett, was patrolling the Banker Strait between Sumatra and Borneo. Intelligence reported a Japanese cruiser moving through the area. Heslett positioned Trenchant in a known Japanese defensive minefield, a location Japanese command assumed no Allied submarine would dare enter. The heavy cruiser Ashigara appeared at dawn, escorted by a destroyer. Heslett waited until the range closed to 4,000 yards, point blank for submarine warfare, then fired 8 torpedoes. 5 struck home. Ashigara sank in 30 minutes, taking 1,200 Japanese troops to the bottom. She was the last major Japanese warship sunk by submarine in World War II. The weapon, a British submarine operating from Australia, hunting in waters too shallow for American boats, achieving a kill that American submarines could have accomplished had they been able to reach the target. The casualty accounting reveals another dimension. Between 1944 and 1945, 3 British submarines operating in the Pacific were sunk: HMS Stratagem, HMS Porpoise, and HMS Stonehenge mined. Total British submarine losses in the theatre: 3 boats. American submarines lost during the same period in adjacent waters, considerably more. The lower British loss rate reflected their operating areas, shallow coastal waters, where Japanese anti-submarine assets were less concentrated, and their smaller size making them harder targets. The human cost requires acknowledgement. British submarine crews endured conditions American sailors found shocking. S-class boats were cramped beyond belief. Crews of 40 to 45 men shared space designed for 38. Tropical heat turned submarines into ovens when submerged. Humidity rotted everything. Patrols lasting 30 to 40 days tested endurance. Unlike American boats that returned to well-appointed bases with recreational facilities, British crews at Fremantle initially had limited shore infrastructure until American generosity provided access to US Navy amenities. Yet morale remained high. British submariners, many veterans of Mediterranean campaigns, approached Pacific operations with professional competence. They knew their boats' limitations and capabilities. They understood they weren't competing with American submarines, but complementing them. The mission wasn't glory. It was strangling Japanese logistics, one small freighter at a time. The operational record includes missions beyond sinking ships. British submarines landed and extracted special forces, conducting 9 shore bombardments, supporting commando operations. They rescued downed airmen, dozens pulled from the Java Sea and South China Sea after being shot down. They gathered intelligence, photographing Japanese installations, reporting enemy movements, mapping minefields. These unglamorous missions rarely made headlines but contributed substantially to Allied operations. By July 1945, Japanese coastal shipping had virtually ceased. Submarines, American and British working in complementary roles, had achieved what strategic bombing alone couldn't: complete maritime interdiction. No supplies moved between Java and Sumatra. Nothing reached Burma by sea. Coastal traffic around Malaya had stopped entirely. Japanese garrisons across the South Pacific were starving, out of ammunition, medically unsupplied, not from spectacular aircraft carrier battles or massive fleet actions, but from patient submarine warfare that sank one ship at a time until none remained. August 15th, 1945. Japan surrendered. British submarines at Fremantle received ceasefire orders. Final patrols returned to base. Crews learned they'd outlasted the enemy. The 4th Flotilla would remain at Fremantle until 1947, not fighting but supporting Dutch efforts to reassert control over the East Indies, a controversial mission that highlighted colonial legacies the war hadn't resolved. The final statistics tell a story of complementary warfare. American submarines: 1,994 vessels sunk, 5.6 million tons. British submarines, all theatres: 1,625 vessels sunk, 1.5 million tons. British submarines operating from Australia, 1944 to 1945. Approximately 500 vessels destroyed, 40,000 tons plus major warships. The British contribution was smaller in absolute terms, but strategically vital in areas American submarines couldn't effectively reach. Cost-benefit analysis favours the British deployment substantially. 9 British and Dutch submarines operating from Australia for 1 year cost approximately $6 million total investment: purchase, maintenance, operation. They destroyed 40,000 tons of shipping plus major warships worth conservatively $50 million. Return on investment: 8 to 1, better than most Allied weapon systems achieved. More importantly, they accomplished missions without diverting American submarines from high-value targets. Every British boat hunting in the Java Sea meant an American boat could focus on deep-water convoy interdiction. Every coastal freighter sunk by British deck guns meant an American torpedo saved for a larger target. The force multiplier effect made British submarines worth far more than raw tonnage sunk suggested. The strategic lesson went largely unlearned. Post-war submarine design evolved toward larger, faster, deeper diving boats. Nuclear propulsion enabled unlimited range and endurance. Modern submarines are exponentially more capable than World War II boats, but they're also exponentially more expensive and often too large for shallow water operations. The niche British submarines filled in 1944 to 1945, small, cheap, expendable boats perfect for coastal operations, disappeared from Western navies. Today, that capability gap matters. Maritime choke points remain shallow. Coastal sea lanes still carry vital commerce, but modern navies build submarines costing $2 to $3 billion each, too valuable to risk in 100-foot deep waters. The British S-class philosophy: adequate capability, low cost, willingness to operate where big boats can't, has no modern equivalent. The veterans who sailed British submarines from Fremantle returned to Britain with little recognition. Their achievements were overshadowed by American submarine successes, by aircraft carrier battles, by the atomic bombs that ended the war. Few histories mention HMS Trenchant sinking Ashigara. Fewer acknowledge the 500 vessels destroyed in shallow Pacific waters. The contribution became a footnote, remembered primarily by Australian historians documenting Fremantle's wartime role. Yet the mathematics remain undeniable. British submarines operating from Australia provided specialized capability at minimal cost. They hunted where American boats couldn't reach. They destroyed targets American torpedoes would have wasted on. They operated for 1 year and strangled Japanese coastal logistics so thoroughly that enemy supplies simply stopped moving. Not spectacular, not headline-worthy, just effective. The lesson cuts across military procurement debates even now. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the most capable one. Sometimes it's the adequate weapon deployed where superior weapons can't go. The British submarine campaign from Australia proved that expensive isn't always better. that niche capabilities matter, that complementary forces multiply effectiveness. On August 31st, 1945, the last American submarine departed Fremantle. British boats remained slightly longer, then they too sailed home. The largest submarine base in the southern hemisphere closed. The wooden buildings rotted in Australian heat. Fremantle returned to being a commercial port, its wartime history fading into memory. But for 1 year, from September 1944 to August 1945, British submarines operating from that Australian base hunted Japanese shipping in waters too shallow, too dangerous, too confined for American boats. They sank warships, destroyed merchant vessels, severed supply lines, rescued airmen, landed commandos, and helped strangle Japan's war economy. They did it with old submarines, limited resources, and quiet professionalism that never sought headlines. The final British submarine departed Fremantle in late 1947. As she cleared the harbour and headed west towards Ceylon, she left behind a legacy rarely acknowledged, that sometimes in war, being small, cheap, and specialised beats being big, expensive, and spectacular. That adequate weapons deployed smartly beat superior weapons deployed poorly. That 9 British submarines hunted where American boats wouldn't go, and in doing so helped win a war most people think American submarines won alone. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. The British arrived late, operated briefly, and achieved results disproportionate to their numbers, not through superiority, but through occupying a niche nobody else could fill. In war, as in mathematics, sometimes the answer isn't building the biggest solution. Sometimes it's deploying the right solution where it's actually needed. The British submarines at Fremantle proved exactly that.